We work to create a world
that's free of infectious diseases.
We work to make sure
that no infectious disease
is left unchallenged.
We discover, develop,
implement and evaluate
health solutions,
working alongside the most at-risk communities.
doing so ultimately builds
a healthier, safer world for everyone.
We are the Kirby Institute.
Thanks everyone for joining us today, both here in the room and those of you joining us online. My name is Dean Murphy. I'm a research fellow here at the Kirby Institute. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that for those of us here today, we're meeting on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. It's also timely, given the theme of today's seminar, to acknowledge the long-standing and continuing contribution of people living with HIV to research, including behavioural and social research, which we'll be focusing on today. The session today will be reflecting on 30 years of the HIV seroconversion study or studies, and we'll get into that in a moment. But before I go any further, I'd like to ask Brent Clifton, who's the Deputy Director of the National Association of People with HIV Australia, or NAPWHA, who's co-hosting today's event, to come up and welcome you.
Thank you, Dean. Good afternoon, everyone, and everyone online. And hello, Garrett. I can see you right in front of me just there, up close and personal. As Dean said, my name is Brent Clifton. I'm the Deputy Director at NAPWHA. For those of you who don't know who NAPWHA is, we were founded in 1989, and we are the peak non-government body representing community-led groups of people living with HIV in Australia. NAPWHA's membership and national network of state-based organisations reflects the diverse makeup of the HIV-positive community and enables NAPWHA to confidently represent the positive voice in Australia. So Dean has asked me to say a few words just to talk about the importance of this event occurring on the eve of World AIDS Day and World AIDS Day itself. So as you all know, World AIDS Day takes place on the 1st of December and has done so every year since 1988. It raises awareness across the world and in the community about HIV and AIDS. It is a day for the community to show respects for people living with HIV and to commemorate people who have died of AIDS-related conditions and other conditions associated with HIV. On this day, we commemorate activism. AIDS activists paved the way and demanded access for treatments through clinical trials, at times with drugs often more poisonous than HIV itself. These activists cut through bureaucratic red tape and demanded to be at the table, decision-making table, where decisions were being made about our own lives and our own bodies. On World AIDS Day, we commemorate partnership. Australia, in particular, has benefited from strong political action on AIDS from both sides of the political aisle. Trusting in research and making evidence-based approaches to take on the great public health challenge that faced our communities in the 80s and the 90s and still to this day, while providing dignity to communities most at risk, something which we sometimes don't always get right. The Australian partnership of community, government, health and research is viewed worldwide as world's best practice approach to tackling the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And this is demonstrated by the relatively low numbers of notifications or diagnoses that we've had in Australia and no broad scale outbreak within the general population of HIV within our community. And World AIDS Day is also about commemorating our volunteers and our allies, our friends and our families, everyone who has taken to the streets to sell red ribbons, and those who have pushed back against stigma and discrimination when it occurs. That is why we commemorate World AIDS Day. So this year, the theme for World AIDS Day is boldly positive. And it aims to encourage Australians to educate themselves and others about HIV, to take action to reduce the transmission of HIV by promoting prevention strategies, and to ensure that people living with HIV can participate fully within the community, free from stigma and discrimination. On a personal note, I just want to convey how happy and proud I am to be here opening this session today. My first job in the HIV sector was providing HIV or positive peer support to newly diagnosed gay men through a workshop called Genesis. And at the end of every Genesis workshop, Ian Down would come into the ACON building and sit down and talk about what the research was and why it was valuable to participate. That research has informed the majority, particularly of while the seroconversion study was running. It helped us develop our programs and the services for people living with HIV, particularly those newly diagnosed. And after my time at ACON, I was even lucky enough to come here and work at the Kirby and be the project lead of the RISE study, which will also be spoken about today. So I have a very proud honour of welcoming you all here to today's session. And just before I do wrap up, I just want to quote a group of people who, whilst not on World AIDS Day in 1983, I believe, really inspired what is self-empowerment within health movements. And you all should be well aware of what the Denver principles are and this particular line that says, "We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence on the care of others. We are people with AIDS." Welcome to today's event.
Thanks, Brent. So in 1992, the first in-depth study was set up to explore the event that people attributed to their HIV seroconversion. Unique in the world, this study investigated the ways in which people understood and negotiated HIV risk. Over time, these studies of HIV seroconversion have identified many important issues and have chronicled, via participants' accounts, many significant developments in the epidemic. So on the 30th anniversary of the first seroconversion study in Australia, and time to coincide with World AIDS Day tomorrow, we decided to bring together researchers who have been involved in this study over its lifetime and to provide reflections on the personal and community impact of the study and its main findings over each specific era. And just to go through the order of events today, first we'll have an overview of the HIV seroconversion studies provided by Garrett Prestige, who I'll introduce shortly. And then each subsequent speaker will cover a different period of the study or studies in chronological order. And with, for those of us who will be doing those chronological periods, we've each kind of set ourselves some guiding questions, which is to reflect on the epidemiological and policy context at the time that research was undertaken, to reflect on the design of the study over the different eras, to share with you some of the insights provided by the study in each particular period, and also then to provide some of our own reflections, including particular things that have stayed with us for one reason or another, either as interviewers or as analysts. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and that is Associate Professor Garrett Prestige. Garrett is a sociologist who's worked at the Kirby Institute since 1992, and Garrett has been closely involved in HIV seroconversion studies over the last 30 years. And he became the study's lead investigator in 2008, and he's also the lead investigator on the current version of the study, called the RISE study. Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, Dean. Am I being heard? Yep. But thanks, Dean. And I'm coming to you from Gundungurra and Darug land. And naturally, there's tradies here today, so there may be some background noise. I've changed my technology around to try and minimise it, so I'm hoping it'll be okay. So I'm giving this overview because I'm one of a very few people who've been around throughout the entire 30 years of the seroconversion study or studies, and maybe the only one who's had some sort of relationship with each phase of the study, with the possible exception of Jeannie. First slide. That's not the one. Yep, that's the one. So throughout the past 30 years, the changes in the HIV epidemic have been enormous. We've gone from a time when, for most of those who received an HIV diagnosis, it was effectively a death sentence, to the time when effective treatments gave us the miracle of people being brought back from the brink. And gradually, the spectre of death was lifted and HIV began to be seen as something that could be managed, through to the more recent years when HIV treatments could also prevent infections, either through U=U or through PrEP. Nowadays, HIV is no longer a constant threat in gay men's lives, and rightly or wrongly, it's no longer something that most people spend much time even considering as an issue. Such a transition would have been an impossible dream in the early 90s, and yet here we are. And throughout that whole remarkable history, we've had some version of the seroconversion study, asking people who'd recently been diagnosed at that time to tell their stories. Over those 30 years, we've had around 1,000 newly diagnosed people respond to the study, mostly gay men, but not only. And of those, nearly 300 were interviewed in detail, telling us about their lives just before and since they were diagnosed, how they believe they were infected, and how their lives were changed by it. Many from those early years have since passed away, but of course others are still with us. Regardless though, their stories remain. Their interviews that they shared with us have been retained and protected. This is a remarkable treasure. Nowhere else in the world would there be such a collection of detailed, heartfelt, and generously told stories from people at the centre of each of those periods in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This is something that we as a community, as researchers, and as custodians of our shared history should honour and commemorate. Next slide. As I said, when the seroconversion study was first set up late in 1992, HIV was still a death sentence for most. The early 90s coincided with the period of the highest death rates from HIV. In 1992, Suki Pax from what's now the Centre for Social Research and Health, and John Caldor from what's now the Kirby Institute, received what I think was a 2-year grant at the time to conduct a study of HIV seroconversion in Sydney and Melbourne. When the funding ran out, the study was continued by internal support from the two researchers for several more years. The two research centres, sorry. Diagnosing clinics referred newly diagnosed patients into the study. Those eligible for the study had to have been recently diagnosed, show evidence of acquisition within the previous 12 months, and for the likely route of transmission to have been sex between men. Between late 92 and 1999, nearly 100 men were interviewed. The main limitation was always doctors needing to actively refer patients into the study, whether that was due to lack of time, resourcing, willingness, just not remembering. Next slide. The interviews themselves were most often conducted in people's homes. Olympia, who ran the study, often saw far more of their journeys after diagnosis than even was captured in the interviews. And at that time, those journeys were filled with sadness, resignation, trauma, rejection, prejudice, and too often illness and death. But they also told Olympia stories of love, hope, determination, and care. A very brief quantitative questions were asked at the start of the interview, which focused on the high-risk event, that men believed had led to their HIV infection, trying to understand the circumstances and the context of those events. Throughout the 90s, study findings were presented to conferences and community orgs, bringing to life the story of those diagnosed at the time. And for many of us, that was the greatest gift of the study. It allowed the issues to be aired, but in their own words, sometimes in pain, sometimes remarkably in joy, but always with generosity and passion. Next slide. The study started to wind down in the late 90s after the introduction of effective treatments for HIV, yet at the same time, infection rates were increasing, as was risk behaviour among gay men. A new iteration of the study was established by attaching it to the Phaedra clinical trial of early treatments among people newly diagnosed with HIV in both Sydney and Melbourne. The survey and interview components were internally funded and continued the collaboration between the two research centres. The referral process was integrated into the trial, so nearly 3/4 of trial participants completed the survey component, but they had to wait at least until at least 6 weeks after their diagnosis before referring the patients for interview. About 50 men ended up being interviewed at that time through that study. And this has also been a recurrent theme, gatekeeping, the belief that whether and when people should be exposed to the trauma of being invited into being interviewed should be a decision of their doctors rather than that of the patients themselves. And you can guess how I've always felt about that particular point. Next slide. Because the survey component of the study was conducted in the clinic by a trained nurse, it was quite brief and limited in scope, and Jeannie was now the person responsible for the interviews, which still primarily focused on the high-risk event, but increasing attention was given to the diagnosis itself and to how treatments affected how they viewed their futures. Next slide. This version of the study really just laid the groundwork for the next main iteration of the seroconversion study. Queensland Health funded us to run a local version of the study, but there was no Phaedra type trial in Queensland to attach it to. So rather than relying on doctors to make the referral, Queensland's HIV surveillance officers directly followed up notifications and approached diagnosing doctors to make the referral to the study. However, small numbers of diagnoses in Queensland meant small numbers in the study, and geographic dispersal made it hard to manage. Even so, we enrolled a higher proportion of new local diagnoses, almost a third, than did any previous or subsequent version, primarily due to the direct involvement of the department to ensure that referrals happened. Next slide. The survey component was completed at the clinic with a trained research nurse or later with the HIV surveillance officer. And next slide. Now, just a brief side note about the WA study that was led by Graham Brown and funded by WA Health. This study was specifically to investigate why so many WA diagnoses were among people, mainly heterosexual men, who had most likely been infected while travelling overseas. The study was broadly conducted in similar ways to how the seroconversion study had been conducted, although referrals also came through WAC. Next slide. Unlike other seroconversion studies, however, no quantitative data were collected, and the focus, of course, included travel and how travel may have played a role in infection. Next slide. As we implemented the Queensland study, two major limitations became increasingly apparent: the small numbers and geographic spread. The small numbers was due to being limited to Queensland, so we started trying to convince other jurisdictions to follow the Queensland model. The second problem of geography would only be exacerbated by expanding the number of jurisdictions. But fortunately, Ian, who'd recently joined the team, suggested that we take the study online, not something that had happened very much back then. This decision immediately opened up the studies so that it would not be limited by geography, and so that the study questionnaires and processes would be much more flexible. So during the 7 years of this version of the study, at various times, all of the state and territory health departments supported the project. which was a collaboration between the Kirby and Archers. Also, with the more flexible structure, we expanded the study to all recent diagnoses, although it was still mostly gay men. Being online, recruitment processes opened up considerably, as well as clinic referrals. Community orgs were able to refer people into the study. But interestingly, up to a quarter of participants were people who found the study themselves through their own online searches, often not long after their diagnosis, which to my mind puts to bed the notion that anyone else, no matter how well-meaning, should make the decision about whether or when someone should be referred to other resources following diagnosis. Over the years of this version of the study, about 700 people completed the survey component and over 100 were interviewed. Next slide. While focusing on the high-risk event and diagnosis was still important, a lot more attention was given to treatment uptake and access to support. There were several journal articles and community reports and a lot of staff feedback sessions across all the jurisdictions. To me, the most notable aspect of this period was the disconnect between what was happening with infections and how that was perceived in the community. This was the period when HIV had become a chronic manageable infection and had largely been slipping out of people's consciousness as an issue to be concerned about, even by gay men. And at the same time, in a period largely before the advent of PrEP, infections remained high, especially among gay men. And despite this, people generally didn't seem to give much thought to HIV, at least until they got infected, that is. And then all the old fears and beliefs about HIV seemed to emerge again. Next slide. Which brings us to the last version of the study called RISE. It had its origin in two things. First, Brenda Allen approached us about how the seroconversion study might help identify the specific role of peer support post-diagnosis. We'd already been looking at this, and Brent felt that it could provide data in an area for which there was little practical evidence and which the community orgs and their state funders really needed. The second issue was that the funding that was being provided through the states and territories was the ideal basis for an NHMRC partnership grant. After a couple of attempts at it, we were finally successful. This version of the study commenced work in 2019 as a collaboration between the 3 research centres, all state and territory health departments, and HIV peer support services. Recruitment was intended to occur online, as well as through clinical referrals with direct and active engagement by the health departments and through the community organisations' own peer support activities. For multiple reasons, there were problems that restricted all of these, and significantly, COVID pretty much sidelined much of our work after the first 18 months or so of active study recruitment. Nonetheless, about 70 people were enrolled by then and over 30 had been interviewed. Next slide. We'd intended to follow participants over time as a cohort to assess the role and impact of support services and informal networks. With COVID having such a direct impact on the study, the numbers were going to remain a significant problem. This had already been an issue, and partly for the good reason that PrEP had had such a good effect on infections overall. But numbers were still low, so, and we're likely to stay that way, so we abandoned the quantitative arm and focused on the qualitative cohort. Despite all of these challenges, the study still managed to produce quite a few outputs and has been highly informative and during a pretty volatile period of the epidemic. Next slide. And let me finish up with some of the words of participants explaining why they participated in a seroconversion study. As you can see, they mostly talk about what they can give to the community to help others in similar circumstances. For me, there's something very special about this study. Throughout its various incarnations across the 30 years, I think what's been of most interest has been hearing the voices of people recently diagnosed. Something that we've all mentioned over the past few weeks in preparing for today has been what emerges from the words of the people being interviewed is all just very human. What they describe is just people living their regular lives and then suddenly finding themselves thrust thrust into an extraordinary situation, one they weren't really prepared for. And even if they weren't surprised by their own infection, they realised they weren't at all prepared for their own reactions to the situation. Their stories together are the story of the HIV epidemic in Australia. They provide a uniquely important and central perspective on that story, one that we need to preserve both to honour them and for the future. Thanks. I'll turn it back to Dean.
Thanks so much, Garrett. I'd now like to introduce Professor Susan Kippax. Sue is the only one of us today, I believe, who has a Wikipedia entry. Sue is a social psychologist and is Emeritus Professor here at UNSW, and was also made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2019. Sue was Director of the National Centre in HIV Social Research from 1995 to 2007, and was a Principal Investigator on the first seroconversion study, which was called Risk Factors for HIV Infection, the Risk Factors for HIV Infection study, which commenced in late 1992. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, and it's good to be here, although I must say it's a long time since I've given a paper and I'm feeling a little nervous. Anyway, I will begin my brief talk by outlining a very brief historical context for HIV in Australia from 1983 to 2000, and focus particularly on the HIV seroconversion study. In 1981, there was concern about the occurrence of a rare cancer in young men in the US, Kaposi sarcoma. 1 year later, it was identified as AIDS, the acquired immune deficiency disease syndrome, and in 1983, HIV was identified as the virus which caused AIDS. HIV spread rapidly in the US and across the world, and AIDS was first diagnosed in Australia in 1982 by Ron Penny, an infectious diseases specialist in Sydney. It spread rapidly in Australia, and particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, and by 1984, it was clear that Australia was going to experience a significant epidemic, mainly among gay men and men who have sex with men. By the 30th of June 1992, there were over 16,000 cases of HIV and 3,000 cases of AIDS had been recorded, 66% of whom had died. The government stepped in reasonably quickly, and in 1983-84 established institutional arrangements and policies which have guided the country since that time. There were three groupings: governments, Commonwealth and state governments and their public health officials; the non-government sector, the AIDS organisations across Australia, which were predominantly gay community oriented; and health professionals and research academics. With regard to the last of these, research academics, by 1985, there were three national research centres, thanks to the then Labor government and his name has escaped me, Neil Blewett, who was the health minister. And these three national centres, one in epidemiology and clinical research, now the Kirby Centre, another in virology, now the Australian Centre on HIV and Hepatitis Virology Research, and the third, the National Centre on HIV Social Research, which is now the Centre for Social Research and Health. It is the last centre, the NCHSR, in which the HIV seroconversion study was initially based, and the idea came, I might say, from the National Centre on HIV Social Research, and we then joined with the what is now the Kirby Institute. The early research of the Social Research Centre was in the main focused on prevention, and that might sound odd now, but in those days, in those very early days, there was no treatment available until we had AZT, zidovudine, became available in 1987 and was finally replaced in 1995-96 by the far more effective treatment, HAART, as it was then called, highly active antiretroviral therapy, but it took till 2010, 2011 to show or to demonstrate that it was also highly effective in prevention. So until about 2010, there was no prevention except the following. So the focus was on prevention. And the focus up until the advent of pre-exposure prophylaxis and post-exposure prophylaxis, the main forms of prevention were for sexual transmission, abstinence, abstain from anal and vaginal intercourse, negotiated safety, or limit the number of sexual partners or negotiate that both partners are negative or both partners are positive, and condom use. We also, in those days, people were advised to get tested and treated for STDs and get tested for HIV. However, HIV testing was not strongly advocated in these early days as there were no effective treatments. Rather, or instead, people were encouraged to treat casual partners as possibly HIV infected and to use condoms always. And with regard to injecting drug use, the advice was either do not inject drugs, or if you do, use sterile equipment, needles and syringes. The HIV seroconversion study was set up, the early study was set up by the two centres and with the AIDS Council of New South Wales initially in 1992-93. The study recruited HIV gay positive men in Sydney, and as the name suggests, focused on what men believed was the event that led to their HIV infection. The study, which was initially a qualitative one, continues to this day in various forms, and I think has had, I'm talking only about the qualitative form, over 250 qualitative interviews, closer to 300 perhaps. I will concentrate here on the very early days of the study and focus on the aims and the findings of the years between 1993 and 2000. The study had a number of aims. First was to describe a set of seroconversion events based on the accounts of recently HIV-infected men. To describe these men's dominant understandings of risk as contained in their descriptions of that event, and to inform health promotion and educational material of the risk narratives used by gay men in order to promote safer sexual and drug use practices. During the period I'm covering from 93 to 2000, 92 homosexually active men were interviewed. The men who were the men who were identified by HIV positive test result within the previous year reported to the study coordinator through a network of general practitioners, HIV diagnostic laboratories, and via the longitudinal cohort study in Sydney. A qualitative method was used, and at the beginning of each open-ended interview, the men were asked to think back and remember the occasion on which they believed they had become infected with HIV. These accounts comprised the men's reconstructions of their risk encounters in an attempt to make sense of their seroconversion. And with one or two exceptions, all accounts that men gave contained a description of why they believed they had become infected. And I must say, the interviews were extremely, I was going to say, they're very detailed. I mean, what struck me then was the enormous amount of detail that men gave about those events, and clearly how important that event was in a very negative way, in the sense that in those days, it meant that they would highly likely die. The themes explored included type of sexual partner, type of sex engaged in, departures from usual sexual practice, their emotional mood, the setting, drug and alcohol use, etc. Typically, the men believed they could identify the event. The men were also asked more generally about their lives, with particular attention to their sexual relationships. The outcomes. The 92 men interviewed in this first phase of the study had a median age of 32 years, and over 60% of them had completed a tertiary degree, diploma, or trade certificate. Most lived in close proximity to the Sydney gay community, and most of them identified as members of the gay community. Now, the risk events that they talked about. Most men attributed their HIV infection to anal intercourse, 53.3% to receptive anal intercourse, 17.4% to insertive, and 17.4% to either one or the other, that is, insertive or receptive. The remainder, 12%, attributed their HIV to oral genital sex. Of those who attributed their HIV infection to anal intercourse, about 3/4 of them said they had not used a condom. Others commented on condom breakage and slippage, while a significant minority practiced withdrawal. 58% of the men were in a regular relationship at the time they believed the seroconversion event occurred, with just under half of these men reporting that they were in a mutually monogamous relationship, and the remainder stating that they and or their partner had casual sex outside that relationship. Just over half the men in these regular relationships were in comparatively new relationships of 1 year or less. 42% of the men had engaged in casual sex only in the 6 months prior to their seroconversion. While 58% of the men were in a regular relationship at the time of the seroconversion, only 42% attributed their seroconversion to their regular partner. All the men in monogamous relationships attributed their infection to their monogamous partner, while just over half the men in open relationships did so. The remainder of the men attributed their seroconversion to their casual sexual encounters. A little under 1/3 of men who believed they were infected within the regular relationship knew that their partner was HIV positive. The remainder believed that their partner was HIV negative or did not know their partner's HIV status. Most men, 75%, did not assume they knew the status of their sexual partners, their HIV status. These findings supported earlier findings from the Netherlands and from Australia that having a known HIV positive partner is implicated in seroconversion, as is, of course, unprotected anal intercourse. The data also indicate the increased risk for men in the first year of a regular relationship, whether this is with an assumed negative or an assumed positive regular partner. The interviews, as I said, explored the risk contexts, and there were 3 contexts that emerged in the interviews. The first one concerned coupledom, what I call the discourse of coupledom, love, trust, and intimacy, and a desire to satisfy their partner. By far the most common reason for seroconversion given by the men who assumed that their partner was HIV negative was misplaced or betrayed trust, mainly with regard to the regular partner, although sometimes with regard to their casual partner. Some men in known serodiscordant relationships also used the discourse of coupledom and related notions of intimacy, and talked a lot about being in love and wanting to be together and to having no barriers between them. There was also a number of men who made reference to a discourse of control, including loss of control, where control included accidents such as condom breakage or slippage, or the influence of drugs and alcohol, or being out of it. With regard to the latter, men almost always were referring to casual sexual encounters. Some men also spoke about being overwhelmed by love or lust. The other most frequent discourse referred to assessment, or discourses referred to the assessment, management, and reduction of risk. These discourses imply a certain degree of rational knowledge about risk and capacity to take decisions in light of that knowledge. One of the recipients who believed, George, sorry. Oh no, that's right. Sorry. The other most frequent discourses refer to assessment, management, and reduction of risk. These discourses imply a certain degree of rational knowledge about risk and the capacity to take decisions in light of that knowledge. One of the recipients, who believed he had a good knowledge of HIV transmission, came to the decision that being exclusively insertive without condoms was sufficient protection. Indeed, because the interviews focused on what the men believed to be the seroconversion event, as well as sexual practices in general, new risk reduction strategies were identified, such as strategic positioning. And I think Jeannie Ellard will say something about this when she speaks after me. In conclusion, the above discourses, the three discourses I've just mentioned, or three broad discourses, revealed in the early stages of the study are related to HIV health-related health promotion, but also to men's sexual experience. The interaction and interweaving of risk and other discourses indicate an ongoing and interactive relationship between health promotion and men's experience and enactment of risk. While this makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to attribute singular causes of HIV seroconversion, it also suggests multiple opportunities for rethinking such issues as risk, pleasure, and control. So, on a more personal level, one of the things that I remember about those interviews, nearly some 30 years ago, or maybe not, I remember many of these early interviews very clearly. And I remember one of the things that struck me at the time was how detailed the memories of the men were. And I assume that was because, as I said at the beginning, how important, in a very uncomfortable way, I imagine, that seroconversion was. And I think the other thing that struck me was the openness and the honesty with which men spoke of what they believed was that event. And just, I'd like to end by just one of the interviews that I still remember that many years ago that I remember best was an account of a man whose regular partner had recently died of AIDS. And some months later, he told me he fell in love with another man, a man with HIV. His new lover knew of the death of this man's previous partner and simply assumed, because this man's previous partner had died of AIDS, that this man was also HIV positive. And the man I interviewed, who was not HIV positive, but negative, told me he was very much in love and didn't have the heart to tell his new partner that he was HIV negative. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue. And just to let you know, we're having a panel discussion at the end, so we'd really welcome your questions and comments at that point. So next I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeannie Ellard. Jeannie is an anthropologist with extensive experience conducting research on the social aspects of HIV and viral hepatitis. She's currently a research fellow at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University. And Jeannie has worked as a researcher and interviewer on the seroconversion study. She worked on that from 2001 to 2006 and has also continued to be involved in subsequent iterations of these studies. Thanks, Jeannie.
Hi, everyone. And like Sue, I'm a bit nervous. I have become very unused to presenting, but it's a great pleasure actually to get to think about this study again. And I really appreciated the framing questions that Dean put to me. It really helped me think about it. So I do indeed come in at the point of where Sue ended there. I arrived at the National Centre in, I think, 2001. And even though the period I'm going to talk about is 2001 to 2006, actually, the way I came to this study was through those earlier interviews, because the first job I sort of had was that I read, coded, thought about those previous interviews. So that was my kind of beginning with them. And I'm looking at Henrika Corner, who I know also worked on that data set. But in 2003, I think I also started conducting the interviews. A couple of things to say about the men in the study. Most identified as gay, and this was absolutely a study of gay men, gay and bisexual men. they were, still are, but were very much the prominent population in the epidemic at that time. Most people were from an Anglo-Celtic background, but there were men from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, but I guess we didn't have these categories that we are working with at the moment of overseas born or newly arrived. So they were just men who appeared in the study, and we didn't particularly differentiate them. I think Sue went on being a fairly middle class group of men that we interviewed. Most were tertiary educated. The age range was between 19 and 65, but the majority were in their 30s. And I think for me, one of the things I reflected on was I was interviewing men in my own cohort. So although it wasn't them, they were very much part of my own kind of social world, but also we had a lot of cultural references in common. And Sue mentioned we continue the practice, or I continue that practice of starting the interview with the question, this very question, can you tell me in your own words how you believe you became infected with HIV? We didn't do that kind of stuff that I think now is, often people said you have to build rapport by talking around the issue. We kind of went in, I suppose, hard. But what always kind of fascinated me was what that elicited. Sometimes it would be someone would go straight to the event, the bodily events that they saw as the context of their event, but sometimes they might go to a location, and often they went to an emotion, how they were feeling at the time. So it was kind of, you never quite knew where that was going to take you. Keep myself. I wanted just to say, perhaps I wanted to slightly push ever so gently back on the concept of story. Yes, these are stories, but from my point of view, and I think probably from Sue, who certainly led the study from that I worked on, these were accounts. They were individual accounts, but their power lay in a way in their collective. The collective nature of them, the capacity for us to look at the patterns in this data. So I want to kind of bring us back to the idea that they are data, they remain data, and they had a value as giving us some real insight into what was going on in the epidemic at the time. They absolutely were accounts in which men were often making sense of their diagnosis, but they were also making sense of the epidemic for us as a sector. And I think that's important to note. I think, one of the other things that the study had a very key role in, and probably always did, but Sue can comment more on this, is that it allowed us often to kind of see things that either were not yet weren't yet appearing in the surveillance data, but also to interrogate a bit more what was appearing in that surveillance data. So I'll move on here. So I was asked what was happening at the time. What were the kind of narratives and themes? So Sue had already mentioned this. But by the time I come to this study and in this period, we're really moving into this redefining of HIV as a manageable chronic illness because of treatment. And I reckon 95% of papers might have started with something along the lines of no longer a death sentence, HIV has. So that was happening. So actually, I think probably for my predecessor as an interviewer, probably my experience was easier. I wasn't I wasn't interviewing men who were likely to die, and I'm sure that mattered to them, and I think it mattered to me in terms of that experience. As there continues to be, there was changing advice in relation to the science in treatment. So the first man I ever interviewed, which I think was in 2003, he was, he had just gone on to treatment. He was not sure he'd made the right decision, and he had a very clear view that he was going to be on treatment for a while and then come off. He was kind of taking a hit hard, hit early approach. Other men in those earlier parts of the 2000s were being encouraged to delay treatment on the basis that their CD4 was not low enough to require it. However, probably towards the end of my period interviewing, I strongly remember interviewing a man who was recently diagnosed, and the data had just come out showing that it wasn't a good idea to take treatment breaks, and that while we weren't moving to the next phase, we were at the phase of once you decide to go onto treatment, you have to see it as a lifelong commitment. And so he was very much grappling with, I'm not sure what to do here. So, you know, there were real changes in the change. Condoms were still the key prevention strategy. We were along, you know, right towards the end, there started to be the Swiss statement and a bit of talk about PrEP. But non-condom based risk reduction was emerging. And it was emerging both as a, let's look at this and understand it. Let's think about this as a big concern. So there's a lot of thinking about that. What else? There was this beginning to be this concern or this grappling with this idea of complacency or its happier outcome of optimism, the idea that treatment was leading particularly gay men to be either complacent about HIV or very optimistic about it. The other narrative I sort of, as I was reflecting and looking back over papers, there was a kind of this discourse of the sophisticated gay man, and this was particularly applied to the idea of risk reduction strategies. And I think a sort of idea that I think any of the people who worked in health promotion probably went, it's a bit more complex than this. An idea, if you just give men the knowledge, then that's all they'll need. And I think, I guess one of the things that was very clear in the seroconversion study is there's a whole lot of things that matter about how information is interpreted and understood. And there was, of course, some debates about barebacking and even gift giving. And sometimes I would get asked questions like, is that there in the data? And I guess one of the things was it wasn't really. You know, most men in the study during that period absolutely had unprotected anal intercourse, but was rarely that planned. But certainly there wasn't much evidence of any kind of deliberate sort of acquisition of, you know, or of recklessness. So, and Dean tells me he can't remember this, but there was an article in the Sydney Morning Herald, I think it was in 2003, that said something. It was, I had written down here about, you know, the denial of HIV, and we did a bit of, we looked at the data and we wrote a letter back to the Herald. We didn't get our letter in the Herald. That's why Dean can't remember it, but I think we did eventually get published in one of the gay newspapers. I was concerned I might have to go to the country town newspaper in the town I grew up in if we didn't get published soon. But, you know, that was, I guess, a bit of a living role for this study. We often were asked to test things out. So what were some of the insights that the study at that time generated? So Sue really talked about it. Relationships continued to be, and I suspect continue to be, a real part of the context of HIV transmission. But I think a couple of things that sort of started to emerge during that period were not just, you know, the intensity in the beginning of the relationships, but certainly some accounts really talked about the end of relationships, and that the ends of relationships were often times where the event occurred. And that, I guess, was about a number of things. Sometimes it was about a person had been in a monogamous relationship, had years of no experience really of negotiating condoms or even thinking about it. Some of it was about, ends of relationships that didn't have a lot of sex in them, and so people kind of venturing back out into the world, so they were there. And I think the other area around relationships that became really interesting, and Garrett, I think, is the person in other studies who really was seeing this, was a kind of role of familiarity. And so actually some of the ideas of casual and regular could get quite blurry. So, and an example of this familiarity, for example, is people who might have broken up with someone 2 years before they meet up with them, things happen, but they operate with their idea that their knowledge about each other's status is the same as it was kind of 2 years ago. But I think just familiarity, even with, the idea of just, this person, so you trust. You trust, and they trust themselves. It's very little, I very rarely have kind of ever felt I was hearing an account of someone who was really deliberately lied to, or I don't want to overstate that. Of course, in those interviews, and I think Sue probably is aware of this too, there are some incredibly sort of sad accounts of, I guess, a kind of betrayal, but it really was not a kind of main issue. But it certainly has led to a bit of rethinking of those kind of just categories of regular and casual. This issue of complacency, there wasn't a lot of evidence of something we might see as complacency, but there were definitely things going on there around the existence of treatment. And I think one of the things that emerged out of this period was HIV lost a certain kind of visibility for gay men, and men often that we interviewed, they had little awareness of even the sort of prevalence of HIV in their immediate vicinity, if they lived sort of in the kind of, I'm looking at Philip and I'm thinking in the gay postcodes, they weren't, I was trying to find a word, I thought postcodes, I'll use postcodes. So a lot, it was a much more nuanced kind of optimism rather than complacency. And I think I've already talked about the uncertainty going on around treatments. I guess before I get into that, I guess the other thing to say about complacency is men knew a lot less about treatments than probably men do now. So in that sense, they also weren't necessarily able to kind of make that assessment that, but what they did do around treatments, they certainly knew, particularly if they were someone perhaps in a serodiscordant relationship. In fact, they might even have been a bit more willing to be in a serodiscordant relationship because they knew that treatment saved people's lives and that the prognosis for people was much better, but they didn't really have an idea that this was played into kind of prevention at that stage, or not many of them did, but I'll come to that in a moment. But men were using the scientific knowledge available to them to manage risk. And I'm looking at Kane because I know he also wrote quite a bit about some of that interpretation of the sites in that period. And certainly you see a lot of people talking about strategic positioning, although people didn't say to you, I'm using strategic positioning, but you certainly lots of accounts where people would say, well, I always tried to avoid being the receptive partner if I wasn't using condoms. So there was certainly some understanding of that. I think the other thing towards the very later years, what also started to emerge was, I think, I don't know if Lumen's in the room, I think she was the person who used this language, a rather crude, yes, she is there, a rather crude negotiated safety sort of started to appear around negative men, perhaps actively using disclosure to determine that they were both negative, but often just perhaps making assumption that they were both negative. And I remember asking a visiting researcher, Harm Hospers from the Netherlands, whether he was seeing any of this in their surveillance data. And at the time he said no, but probably within, I don't know, a year, I can't quite remember the year we were having that conversation, it was very much appearing in our own surveillance data. But certainly in this period, it's happening, but it's not necessarily being informed by a lot of good strategizing. I wanted just to, so I kind of said that most, I just realized I can't, that's so small, I can't read it. So to allow people to read the quote themselves. But while I say many people didn't, there, now I can. Sorry, someone did something fancy with the slide for me. There were cases of much more explicit talking about viral load and understanding of viral load. And this is the only bit of, I guess, data I'm going to throw up here. So Alex says, I think it does all stem from being absolutely in love, knowing that what was the person I wanted to spend my life with and thinking it through and going, I feel reasonably comfortable making this decision based on the science information that I have. And I've got a reasonable science background. Making the decision with that knowledge, his viral load was undetectable and had been for quite some time as a managed risk, which means there is a risk, but we can manage it. And part of that risk might be that I seroconvert. I just will give a little bit of context to Alex. So obviously Alex is in a seroconversion study, so that didn't work. I'm not here about to cast doubt on very significant scientific evidence to the contrary, but I guess it's again about, it's not just about giving people the information. So for Alex and his partner, what happened was his partner became quite non-adherent to his medication. They weren't communicating all that well at the time of the event. And so that wasn't kind of discussed. And, so that's contextual stuff that has to go along with that, with that scientific evidence. Okay. I think just perhaps how am I going for time, Dean? Am I nearly there? Yeah, I guess the final area I just wanted to touch on that was an area I was interested in and worked on was kind of the way blame and responsibility played out in these accounts. And perhaps what's so surprising about it all seemed at the time when I first was looking at this is that the absence of blame. People talked much more about self-responsibility and having agency or having a shared and mutual kind of responsibility for whatever had happened. And I guess what was striking about it, because it was happening in this context where there was starting to be some sort of criminal cases, particularly not among gay men actually, but although later on, right towards the end of my time, I think we get the Michael Neal case in Melbourne. But there was a lot of talk about criminalisation and concern. And sometimes people would anecdotally who worked in AIDS council would say, oh, we have people ring up all the time and say they want to, they want to do something about this person they believe typically put them at risk, they believe put them at risk of HIV rather than transmission. But it just wasn't borne out in the data. And this was going to, And actually, Dean Murphy and I actually did some work to try and kind of map those sort of discourses of responsibility to some of the kind of across the health promotion over time. And while in a way some of the discourses around responsibility did change quite a lot over the course of the epidemic, in some ways it didn't change so much in the narratives of men. And interestingly, a colleague of ours in the UK, Catherine Dodd, I presented once with her, and she was presenting data on survey data on criminalisation and all this, and it was kind of was saying that negative men were saying, well, no, we think that positive men are responsible and they should do this and they should do that. And I was sort of grappling with that. Why is that so different? And she pointed out to me, because the men you're talking about, it's now framed by their experience of having seroconverted. So in a sense, in coming positive, they come to kind of question the type of thinking they may have had prior to seroconverting. I quickly will say memorable moments. I do almost all the research I ever do now online, partly because of the pandemic. But then I used to go in, I had the privilege really of going into men's homes, sometimes very, very beautiful apartments, and sometimes I would be in someone's tiny bedroom in their shared house. And I think Asha Person and I tried to write about this rather unusual intimacy of kind of being invited into people's homes and talking about, you know, a pretty personal part of their life. The sort of, really memorable for me is this shared process of sense making with these men and both making sense of their experience, and I come back to that, making sense of the epidemic for us. There was the privilege of hearing their accounts, and just to give you a sense of how perhaps, you know, every day some of this was. I was once interviewing a man at his house at about, I don't know, 8 o'clock at night, maybe we finished at 8:30. It's the only time he was probably the oldest person in the study. You know, he was in his 60s and his partner was there. It's also the only time I'd ever interviewed someone with their partner there. Anyway, I get up, we finished, I get up to leave. They say, so your car's parked outside, is it? And I say, oh, no, I'm just going to walk up and get the bus. And they say something like, or he says to his partner, Barry, that's absolutely not, Barry, get the car out. And these men drove me home to and I don't know what an ethics committee might make of that, but I certainly never felt unsafe but I guess that again comes back to that generosity, but the sort of interesting experience. And finally, I will just say, I think the way I've been thinking about it is, what's the value of these kinds of studies, but also what might we lose if we don't do this kind of, I guess, critical, deep social research. So the value of it allows us to understand changes in perception of risk. So even though those bodily ways that you get HIV don't change very much, how we perceive them or how men perceive them or how anyone perceives them change. We get some insight into how scientific information is actually being interpreted. We get to understand those contexts, get access to collective meaning making. And I think the other thing is it's this kind of interesting thing that you get an insight into both the lives of negative men and the lives of positive men in the same kind of data set, and I'll end there.
Thanks, Jenny. That was great. I really love the way you also drew in at least half a dozen of our colleagues in the room and elsewhere into that conversation. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Ian Dow. Ian is a researcher at the Centre for Social Impact here at UNSW. He actually undertook his PhD on data from the seroconversion study, and that was entitled Experiences of HIV Among Newly Diagnosed Men in Australia, Gay Community, Relationships and Connections. Ian worked on the seroconversion study from 2009 to 2017, and he'll talk about that period right now as we continue to inch our way towards the present day.
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, thank you for having me here today. Excuse me. So I worked on the study between 2009 to 2017. As Garrett mentioned, this was the study, the iteration of the study that had began with that small study in Queensland and moved on to the study in WA. It was an online study, which meant that we could also invite other jurisdictions to participate and take advantage of the fact that there was that sort of easier way of collecting data. So the aims of the study were to understand the circumstances in which the men acquired their infection, and also to identify any changes that may have occurred since receiving their diagnosis. So also thinking about the impacts of receiving a diagnosis and the risk of onward transmission and things like this. So being an online survey, the majority of participants were actually referred through online promotion, although we did work closely with the AIDS councils and PLHIV organizations, as well as clinics, to try and encourage recruitment to the study. At the end of the online survey, all participants were asked if they would like to also volunteer for a face-to-face interview. And they were slightly different, actually, the interviews that we conducted, insofar as the interview began with asking about the period prior to the event that led to the men believed led to their infection, and then moved on to how the men believed they acquired their infection, and then the impact of the diagnosis and any changes that may have occurred after. So during that period, 2006 to 2016, 707 men completed the survey. 110 were interviewed face-to-face. The mean age was slightly larger than those in the previous version, slightly older than the men in the previous version of the study, mean age of 35. But otherwise, the profile of these men was not much different to the men in the previous versions of the study. So yes, what was happening at the time, I guess, the sort of background to while these men were acquiring their infection and being diagnosed. Absolutely, as the previous speakers have alluded to, HIV was very much redefined as a manageable chronic illness. And by this time, non-condom based risk reduction was being widely used. I mean, we were seeing that in all the research that was being conducted. So the fact that men were choosing to engage in risk reduction, so non-condom based risk reduction strategies, was a real challenge for health promotion. And I'm thinking pre-2010 here, so before the evidence around the role of treatment and prevention and PrEP, and I think about some of the campaigns. So as I mentioned, the challenge for health promotion was how to communicate the more nuanced information around how to effectively apply risk reduction, and the challenges insofar as the people who funded, the people who do the health promotion, the state governments, sort of insisted that the main message had to be condoms, condoms every time, that as the most effective way of preventing transmission. So I just thought, just to place ourselves in the time period that we're talking about, I put a couple of campaign images here that were used by ACON around that time. So condom reinforcement was still occurring, but you can see, I mean, I think it was a challenge to present a sort of compelling argument around the importance of condom use. So what else was happening at the time? So there was changing advice and science in relation to treatment, particularly in regard to its role in prevention. And there was the start of some emergence of evidence around the efficacy of PrEP, but you know, it was not until towards the very end of the study that PrEP was actually available here. And also HIV testing. So over the course of this study, HIV testing was becoming easier and much more accessible. So delivered in different formats, so community-based testing, rapid testing, those sorts of things. So these three things, treatment as prevention, PrEP, easier access to HIV testing, really were what changed from, you know, the previous, you know, condom reinforcement type of campaign to the type of campaign, the ambitious campaign, like ending HIV, for example. But just thinking about, because I did want to put some quotes from the interviews themselves up into the slides. So I just want to put one here that I think, you know, speaks to the sort of benefit, how make something like making testing more easily available and accessible helped. So this was from one of the participants in the seroconversion study, who was asked, was HIV something you wanted to avoid? And he responds, something that I wanted to avoid, but it's not something that I necessarily proactively avoided, if that makes sense. I tried, I did. Basically, having condomless sex, I knew the risk that I was undertaking. So practicing unsafe sex was something that I did, and I understood the risk that I was sort of engaging in and what it could mean for me. Probably not in its entirety, but I guess that's one of the reasons why I was getting tested so frequently, was because I knew it was a very real possibility of contracting, but I wanted to make sure that if it happened, I was at least on top of it straight away, basically. So this was someone who tested every couple of months. You know, he was aware that he was engaging in behaviors that would put him at risk, and just wanted to be on top of it so that he could prevent onward transmission and also, you know, treat his infection when it inevitably occurred. So in terms of insights for the study, so what this particular version of the study revealed that had not yet had not been revealed in the earlier studies. A similar proportion of the men in this study attributed their infection to sexual contact with a casual partner. So it's about 2/3, about 60%. But when we asked about the partner to whom the men attributed their infection, we included a different category of sex partner, so that of a fuck buddy. So fuck buddy would be a regular sexual partner, but outside of the context of a sort of romantic relationship. So, and we found that actually a quarter of the men attributed their infection to sex with a fuck buddy. So we found that very few infections were attributed to sex with the men's regular partner or boyfriend. I mean, we specified boyfriend rather than saying regular partner. And it was about 1 in 10. And of those relationships, the majority of them were quite new relationships. So as Ginny mentioned earlier, we could really see the role of familiarity there. So the newer or the less the men knew about the sex partner, the more risky or the more likely, they were more likely to attribute their infection to someone that they knew they did not have much prior knowledge of. So this version of the study, we had quite a lot of study outputs in terms of journal articles, also community reports, Also, we worked very closely with the health departments and the HIV, PLHIV and AIDS councils in each state and territory, and did a lot of community feedback. And in terms of memorable moments, there were so many for me. I mean, I interviewed almost 100 men for this study, and there are so many that sort of stayed with me after the interview and continue to stay with me. So I'd just like to read one. It's been mentioned by the previous speakers just how sort of human the stories, the ways in which these men tell the stories. And so this is a quote from an interview with someone who had he'd received his diagnosis. He understood the importance of early treatment. He understood the benefits of early treatment, both for his own health and also to reduce the risk of onward transmission. And he was really keen to begin treatment, but he talks about when he actually had his script filled. He was traveling. He was in a regional part of the state in which he lived. He says about that night, I was away from home.
Thanks, Ian. I'm introducing myself now. As I said before, I'm Dean Murphy and I work as a research fellow here at the Kirby Institute. And I was closely involved in the development of the current version of the HIV seroconversion study called the RISE study. I've been working on that since 2018. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge the funders of the current version of the study. So it's an NHMRC partnership project, and it involves funding from all the state and territory health departments, and also in-kind support from all the HIV community organisations in each jurisdiction. And also want to acknowledge my colleagues who work on the study. I can see Nathan here, Jeannie currently works on the study as well, and Steve Philpott, who's recently left the Kirby Institute, as well as a few others, and also our advisory committee and the investigators on the study. So this version of the study called RISE, a recent diagnosis and the impact of support on experiences of HIV. As Garrett mentioned earlier, it was originally supposed to be both a quantitative and qualitative study, but the survey was discontinued at an earlier point. Eligible participants were diagnosed 2016 or later. So context, it's 2018 until now, it's very much the biomedical prevention era. So there's been a focus on testing, diagnosis, linkage to care and retention in care, treatment, and viral suppression. Also biomedical prevention, PrEP, and the use of undetectable viral load. Also emphasis on HIV elimination and strategies such as ending HIV. Also, in the current period, there's much more, as Jenny alluded to earlier, an emphasis on overseas born or newly arrived gay men in particular. And just the context, just to note that the study exactly maps onto the current HIV strategy 2018 to 22, with the emphasis that I just mentioned. So participants, we're kind of, the median age is now 32.5, I think it is. So it's kind of remained pretty much the same the whole 30 years. Yeah, so quite young and fairly consistent. Most of our participants, we have actually 35 now, but most are still gay men, but more bisexual men, heterosexual men, and women. And we have possibly more diversity in terms of regions of birth. So that epidemiological or policy context also has had an influence on the design of the study. And as I mentioned, the partnership funding was based on looking at ways in which we could improve the HIV cascade of care and referral pathways, including to peer-based support. The study now covers a really broad range of topics, and in addition to diagnosis and treatment, testing patterns, prevention strategies, it also includes peer support, testing history, migration, community connectedness, sex relationships after diagnosis, as well as a seroconversion event. So it's seroconversion event is a small part. And then of course, there was COVID, and we actually added a whole new section on experiences and impact of COVID on lives in general, but also HIV clinical care. And we don't ask about the seroconversion event at the start. We actually ask about diagnosis at the start and then kind of work backwards. So in some ways, it's a smaller component of the study than it was historically. As I said, we now have more of a focus on the experiences of overseas born and newly arrived men. And to date, there's been a range of outputs. And just to give you a flavour of the kind of things we've focused on, there's been some emphasis on experiences of diagnosis, the ways in which diagnosis is delivered, the impact on people's lives. So for example, the idea of biographic disruption, people's journeys to reaching undetectable viral load, and looking at the sociology of diagnosis. Also, there's been quite an emphasis on disclosure in both social, family, and also sexual settings, and on social media, and also on peer support. So new insights. What we've found in relation to risk in the seroconversion event. Interestingly, a role of people moving between jurisdictions, and particularly moving between the main capital cities and becoming disconnected from sexual health care, including HIV testing in the period prior to infection and diagnosis, which is interesting. You wouldn't think that moving between Melbourne and Sydney, for example, would mean you would fall out of sexual health care. And for several people in our study, that also meant discontinuing PrEP. And so that brings us to PrEP breakdowns. About a third of the gay men in the study currently were either on PrEP at the time they were diagnosed or had previously been on PrEP and had discontinued in various different ways, but none of them had actually discontinued for the kind of reasons you see in the literature as a kind of an active decision to stop PrEP. They'd kind of, in fact, it was very hard to characterize them as decisions at all in many cases. And quite a lot of emphasis, as I mentioned, on diagnosis. So what we've identified in the study is a diversity of the locations in which people are diagnosed. Also emphasis on new testing technologies, so rapid testing in particular, experiences of treatment initiation. Many people initiate treatment on the same day they're diagnosed. Focus on social impact opposed to health concerns. Still quite a number of late diagnoses, even among metropolitan gay men, and I suppose it's something we might talk about in the panel discussion. Jeannie mentioned something that made me think about it. We, certainly, I'm looking at Philip again, postcodes. We certainly, there's still men who live in inner city postcodes who might physically be in that postcode, but in terms of kind of the crossover of the physical and social environment, they're still seroconverting and sometimes not getting tested and therefore diagnosed until quite some period after that. I've also been interested in the idea of the diagnosis assemblage, so the way in which spaces, bodies and affects kind of come into the frame there. And this is a quote from something we've written, so objects such as chairs, waiting rooms, reception desks, computer screens and documents play their part in diagnosis, as do facial expressions, voices and gestures. So this is the concept of an assemblage, and we could use this, we'll apply the same to seroconversion as an assemblage of different things. And I was really struck by Sue's account, you know, people bring in things that are not just the other person present, it's like their clothes, the location, and other things. So just some additional insights or reflections. In addition to the interviews covering a broader range of subjects, we now, of course, mostly conduct interviews by video conference or telephone. As Jeannie, I think, gave a really good insight earlier, you know, it's different from being present in somebody face to face, and especially different from being in someone's home. Also, the study is now longitudinal, so we interview people up to 3 times, and often the second round interview, they actually provide more information about the seroconversion event than they had at the initial interview. And often they say that that first interview had given them the opportunity to reflect and think about that. Yep, so I think that's an interesting thing that we get from having a longitudinal design. And also sometimes use their interview to kind of reclaim power or status that was lost in their experience of seroconversion or diagnosis. So, yeah. So in terms of reflections, some interesting, I was interested in the way that some people talk about their relationship to HIV. I'm not sure I'll read the whole quote, but this one has stayed with me. Flynn, who said, "I've been getting ready for that moment my entire adult life, but nothing could prepare me for it." One of my thoughts was, oh, it actually happened. I think as gay men, we all in some respect expect to become HIV positive, or at least we mentally prepare ourselves to become positive. You know, it's definitely a legacy of the epidemic. And he kind of repeats that a little bit more. So yeah, I was kind of interested in the way that provides an insight into the historical association between HIV and gay or queer sexuality. And also the fact that several participants talk about, after being diagnosed with HIV, having what I thought was surprising desire to go back and kind of connect with the early period of the epidemic via, mostly through fiction and popular culture. So as most of you probably know, it was pretty traumatic, some of that early AIDS literature. But instead of identifying against that, actually, in many cases, identify quite closely with it. Reflections continued. What others have already said, the importance of sociological analyses. And I'm also, I guess, struck by the fact that the virus itself is not really discussed that much in terms of people's accounts of seroconversion. So it makes me, wonder, where is HIV? And kind of then thinking of it from a sociological point of view, what's it like for HIV at the moment? If you think about it, it's a pretty inhospitable environment because the virus is circulating in the context of a lot of antiretrovirals. So either within the body, it's being suppressed. When it tries to move to another body, it might be coming up against more antiretrovirals in the form of pre-exposure prophylaxis. Yeah, so yeah, kind of just thinking about or with the virus. But I think, it's important to note that people don't often talk about their seroconversion in technical or scientific ways. I think that kind of resonates with what people have said before. But so much so that the virus is kind of almost not mentioned. And it kind of reminded me of this quote from Joan Didion, who I think it's an interesting parallel. She says, "You'll notice that participants in disasters typically locate the beginning of the disaster at a point suggesting their own control over events. A plane crash retold will not begin with the pressure system over the Central Pacific that caused the instability over the Gulf, that caused the wind shear at Dallas-Fort Worth, but at some manageable human intersect. For example, that funny feeling ignored at breakfast." And sorry, I don't think I had the quote up there while I was reading it. And so that's the end. I just wanted to give a flavour of the kind of current period of the seroconversion study, the RISE study. And so that therefore concludes the section on each of the chronological periods. So I wanted to now invite John Rule, who's a Senior Research Manager at the National Association of People Living with HIV. John does also have a social science background and has published in many areas on community development, education, health systems strengthening. And he continues at NAPWHA to be involved in research dissemination. And has worked in Australia and overseas as an advocate for people living with HIV for over 25 years. So thanks, John.
And I think in that introduction, it's necessary to say that I'm a person living with HIV. My title I called, Do I Have the Words? Because I'm not sure I have the words right now to wrap all of this up. I've got about 10 minutes of thoughts, and I've had the advantage of seeing other people's presentations being developed and discussions I've had with Jeannie and Dean. I want to start with a quote from a fellow called Ricky Price, who published something in September 2019, and it was from a journal called On Curating. The communities who confront the virus are heterogeneous, and so HIV/AIDS community histories are nested in longer struggles against poverty, racism, sexism, and homophobia and other phobias. The community within which a person acquires the virus, the place in which a person encounters the virus, and the time in which a person seroconverts create different constellations of collective memories, reinforcing different shared realities with the same virus. So it's not my job here right now to agree with everything that's gone before. In fact, I want to kind of push things forward a bit because if seroconversion studies are to have some resonance in the future, I think for people living with HIV, then they have to kind of tap into something about this collective experience and shared realities. So I've spent 2 weeks thinking about this. I've been at the NAPWHA Treatment Outreach Network meeting. I've been at the NAPWHA Annual General Meeting, and I was at a continuing medical education program with some of my NAPWHA colleagues and clinicians the other day. So I just want to recount a conversation with my older NAPWHA friends and colleagues at our AGM last week in a meeting break after a presentation on some research that was commissioned by NAPWHA into HIV-related stigma. We found ourselves talking about our seroconversion experiences. Surprisingly, we had never shared these with each other. In fact, a couple of us had never spoken with another person about our seroconversion illness and experience. And I ponder why this was the case. I guess for many of us, revisiting the memory was too much. Seroconverting when others were sick and dying was a shameful and traumatic experience, and we've heard a lot of that earlier. But I want to sit that beside what's kind of happening now sometimes. So what would be the advantage of recalling those early experiences now? Perhaps not much. Perhaps many of us don't want to recall them. However, I think maybe it is a time we revisited some of those earlier experiences of seroconversion and compare to what's happening now. So the reason why is I think there must have been some protective factors in our lives at that time that might be of interest to others. We were called sluts, stupid, ignorant, dumbass failures, and that we had let the team down. But we have also survived, and surely there's some interest in how we managed that. To bring it to the present a bit, Justin, I hope you don't mind me repeating a conversation we had last week. I said to Justin, is there any point in the seroconversion studies and stories? Justin offered the observation that retrospective diagnosis stories would be interesting because in the middle of it, you can't see what's happening. And I think that's what Dean was referring to in the longitudinal, the kind of coming back to what happened at that event. So as the event is there, I'm also hearing us talking about the event itself may be fading, but, you know, then drawing that event into a more social and broader experience. I think the kind of research that we're talking about is one that's about a collation of accounts, narratives, and collective narratives. You know, people living with HIV are encouraged to tell their stories. Sometimes they get sick of it. But, you know, the advantage of research is that research tells us back those stories. And hopefully those stories matter when we hear them told back or contextualized or given a kind of place in history. So I asked people as I was going around the last couple of weeks, what kind of information is of interest to people living with HIV now, and how might seroconversion studies help us understand a bit more about what's going on. People were interested in access to and retention in care, linking into peer navigation and support, treatment uptake, treatment types, cure research, patient journeys, not a singular trajectory, roller coasters, loops, etc. And that we are at another time of change in the epidemic, and narratives created through seroconversion studies now will be valuable in understanding where we are in terms of PrEP, undetectability, new treatments, HIV management expectations. Why would people enter a seroconversion study if they continue into the future? There's a kind of bit of a comparison with why you would enroll in a clinical study. One is you're supported, there's some follow-up, someone's coming back to you. And Dean's given, and Ian may have given the kind of reasons why people altruistically want to you know, share their experience so that others learn from that. I also wonder where we might be if we lose some version of the seroconversion study moving forward. What might we lose if we don't have that moving forward in terms of our capacity to produce relevant and effective health promotion programs and support people living with HIV? And Ian, you talked about that, and Brent, you talked about it earlier in the way that research comes back into some of those genesis and workshops, etc. I had a conversation with our colleague, Dr. Kirsty Machin, because I think one of the absences in the seroconversion studies have been the experiences of women. Kirsty wanted to contribute that specifically a study of women in the seroconversion would be good. But this is where I think my title, Do I Have the Words, does have some kind of meaning. You often don't have the words when you're in the experience, and you might not even have the words 5 or 10 years later, but maybe 15 years later, you might have the words and you can see that event and you might be able to communicate something about that event. So from the women's point of view, and this is feedback from Kirsty, a lot of women don't have the words themselves at the time of seroconversion, and sometimes even until much later. So seroconversion studies are important moving forward, and specifically something around the experiences of women. Dean, you talked about the assemblage, and I won't go into that. I just wanted to make sure the meeting had the information that there's been some amazing work done in Queensland, and it's a testing to treatment trajectory study. It was a qualitative study, longitudinal study, 42 people who were recently diagnosed. Their definition of recently diagnosed they used was in the last 5 years. There was some amazing papers that were published as a result of that study. One was the HIV health literacy beyond the biomedical model. I don't have the time to go into all the details, but the the study shows the way at the point of seroconversion or diagnosis, there's a couple of people involved, and it just goes into a longer story about the patient journey. There was another paper they put out, Understanding the Social and Emotional Dimensions of HIV Self-Management. Again, it kind of punctured the myth, I think sometimes, that it's a simple kind of treatment trajectory, you know, and I think Chris Howard, our colleague, has said sometimes I don't live on that care cascade. I live in this kind of social world. And I think the seroconversion studies can help bring out what that social world is about. And another paper that they put out as a result of that study in Queensland was, they're my go-to people. And they did a kind of mapping then of who people were connected with at the point of seroconversion, who they were connected with 2 years on, who were they connected with 5 years on. It was really kind of interesting maps that were drawn about who was important at what time. So I kind of want to finish on perhaps the values of future seroconversion studies. I realise this requires funding. I realise it requires a place to put things and people to do this work. And again, if I think about moving from that event to the social experience, because I really think we really need to land in the social experience with people who have had that individual experience. So I think future seroconversion studies could talk about how people feel about engaging with support services, which ones, public, private, community-based. Are there currently ways to quantify how rapid medical and social interventions are put into place for people undergoing a seroconversion or after seroconversion and diagnosis? And to assess the quality of connections between mainstream support services or non-HIV specialists, HIV specialist services, and the other networks of services in which we find we then have to live our lives. And I think I want to finish on those kind of notes that I think, yeah, we've got the event, we've looked at the event, we've kind of dug away at what that event is. And I think the trick now is to kind of put that event in the social world and then help people negotiate that social world as they have to after seroconversion and diagnosis. So I hope I've spoken enough, Dean, and I know there's not a lot of time for conversation, but there we go.
Might get my speakers to maybe sit over there, and Garrett will be joining us on the screen. So yeah, I'd like to invite anyone who had a comment or a question. So if you're in the room, you could please go up to the mic, and we also will have questions via the Q&A on Zoom. Philip.
Thanks, Dean, and thanks very much everyone who spoke. It's been an amazing afternoon. And I guess what I was thinking about was, in terms of what you were explaining about the current iteration of the study and the longitudinal nature. So, you know, there are repeat interviews, and what John was saying about, you know, the social. In terms of people who are recently diagnosed and their experience of stigma, you know, we hear that upon learning of their diagnosis, that one thing that people are really concerned about is, you know, having to face the stigma of being HIV positive from others. And I wonder whether, you know, in the second or third interview, people talk about what impact that's had, what effect it's had on their social relationships, how they've negotiated it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll start, Philip. Yeah, one thing that is really interesting, and I think Jeannie touched on this quite nicely, is that people who are recently seroconverted, actually what they bring to the interview is a lot of their reflections and experiences as HIV negative people, because the shift is quite recent and often they're not yet even identifying as a person living with HIV in the way that we kind of somewhat unproblematically use that term. So sometimes they actually speak about their own stigma towards, negative attitudes towards people living with HIV, and how seroconverting is causing them to reflect on that. So that comes up a lot in the first interview, but in subsequent interviews as well. Subsequent interviews, they're learning to deal with it. But also when they talk about diagnosis, it's often, I kind of sometimes call it like a social death. They kind of think that the health side of things is pretty unproblematic in this, current era. But yeah, lots of social impacts. So I might just ask others on the panel to chip in there.
I don't know that I have much to add, although one thing, because I've also been looking at the recent interviews, I think really strikes me is people are much more likely to disclose to other people that they have HIV. Whereas and again, like I haven't gone back and read all of the data from that period in the early 2000s, but I think something about kind of treatment and those kind of stigma, but I guess for the men, it might have manifested as shame. I think often in the accounts I was reading, I think that's a real shift, because I think basically people often just didn't disclose to other people. And so I think that probably speaks to concerns about stigma, but I think that's something that's kind of shifted a bit now.
Kane first.
Yeah, thanks from me too so much. I mean, it's so amazing to think that there is this same study in various forms running for that long. It must be like the longest running study, maybe not. But a couple of things that occurred. It struck me as really interesting, but also actually kind of quite surprising that people seem to have such clarity about the risk event. Because actually, when you're thinking about, particularly in the early years, encounters that are kind of fraught with fear and danger, it's hard to have clarity on what's happening. And it also suggests that people sort of experience risk events as events rather than something that's just episodic that they don't have clarity about. And so I guess I just had a question about, are there moments in any sort of phase of the study where people aren't really certain about the risk event, or they prevaricate about what might have happened and that sort of thing? So that's one thing I'm interested in. The other thing was just about sex and I mean, HIV infection. This sort of goes to Dean's point around the connections between gay sexuality and HIV historically. HIV is often experienced or constructed as an indictment on your sexuality. And so I understand that might not have been the sort of focus of the earlier versions of the study, but I think it's really interesting to think about, well, how does HIV infection affect people's feelings about their sexuality? And, what are the various forms that takes going forward? And I know there is some data that suggests that people's sex lives drops off, a lot of people, and then comes back slowly. But I think that'd be really worth exploring, because I think that there are a lot of other things that we worry about that are associated with the difficulty of understanding oneself as a sexually active subject when one is first diagnosed. So I'm thinking about particular forms of drug use, I guess. Yeah. Say something on that. There is a future study, for example, recently asked people, you can change your sex practices or your expectations after diagnosis, and the overall, yes, and but it's only a simple question. It'd be worth exploring, I think, including longitudinally.
Yeah, Sue.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to the first part of your question, but I certainly was struck by the detail that men gave of the event as they saw it, or this, how they became HIV infected. But I mean, this might sound a bit odd, but I suppose what I'm saying is I'm not sure and have never been sure about how much those stories change over time. And many, many years later, or not that many years later, I had an event of my own, which was giving birth. And I somehow, I don't know why I did, but I wrote an account of it for myself. Quite a lengthy account of what happened. It was a very straightforward birth. And then I remember about 2 or 3 months later talking to a female friend who'd also just given birth, and we talked about our birthing experiences. And I then went back and read the account I had written, and it was different. Not very different. And the initial, the major bits were there, but what amazed me was how my memory had changed, or how my account had changed over time. And that made me wonder about, but just now, it made me wonder about how, I'm not suggesting that men make it up, but how later events change the stories that one remembers, or not change the stories, but change how one remembers. And I don't know whether anyone's had experiences of that, but it's a very interesting question, I think, because the thing that I do remember, in fact, I think Garrett and Jenny remember, is the amount of detail in those stories. And I wonder whether the detail, I don't mean elaboration in any dishonest way, but over time, things get built into the way one remembers. I don't know. And what that might tell you or tell one about how changes in the way people lead their lives changes their memories.
And just to respond to the first question as well, I think in the current era, people are often less able to identify a particular event and often choose like a period. And then they also learn after diagnosis about the concept of a seroconversion illness, and that kind of technical information often helps them. And often we'll pick an event that is likely for particular reasons. And that's one reason I use that Joan Didion quote, because it's likely because they had a bad feeling about it, or it, that person was dodgy, to use an example. And so I always knew there was something wrong with him. And so, yeah, that's what your question made me think of, yeah.
Kate, I would just comment that perhaps sometimes we gloss it a bit too neat too. Certainly there are people who we were asking them to choose an event. So that's, but there's certainly accounts where people are, or let's pick one, or there's, so I think there is some of that. And I just wanted to quickly say about, that stuff about sex, and I think at times when I was more, there is some interesting, I think, data around that, both around the, and one of the things I really remember is people who'd ever been diagnosed, who believe what happened was a pretty low risk event, and they really, that's one thing, people really struggled to find an event that was a classic event. I remember a lot of those men had a lot of kind of, and this is pre sort of undetectable viral, real concerns about, felt very vulnerable about their sexuality and their, that if this happened to them, how could they kind of trust that? So I don't know if that fits a bit in that part, but it is an interesting thing that needs.
Thank you. Thanks.
Can I?
Oh, Garrett.
Because actually there are a couple of things. The 2009-2016 period, because we had both a lot of quantitative data plus the qualitative data, there actually was an analysis that we did, which was specifically around the thing about changes in behaviour. And I can't remember, but that's written up. I think it might be in Jade's. I'm not sure where it is. But there was actually a paper, and it was actually looking at peer support. But it happens that in that paper, it also details the perceptions of the changes in behaviour. And Jeannie's right that, of course, what we've asked them to do is to pick an event, and very often they're reflecting on the fact that there was a whole lot of events, and they have to actually choose one. And it's reminded me that we actually, way back in the 90s, when we had the SMASH cohort, we actually had data from men before and post seroconversion. There was only a small number of seroconverters, but I think about 50 or so in the sample. But I remember for one of the ASHM conferences, we actually looked at the behaviours prior to and post seroconversion. And it just showed dramatically that big change in behaviour. So prior to seroconversion, really large numbers of partners, lots of risk behaviour, and post seroconversion, numbers dropped right off, and risk behaviour was virtually non-existent. And of course, a lot of men in seroconversion studies throughout have talked about that issue of once they receive the diagnosis, feeling like they didn't want to risk the possibility of infecting someone else, and so dropping back from sexuality for at least some time.
Thanks. 2 final questions. Gillian.
Thank you. My question follows on the question about stigma. Earlier this year, I was at a conference attended, well, it was a conference for all of the new board members on the local health districts and network books in New South Wales. So big attendance, also attended by senior executives of New South Wales Health. And they'd been talking about non-judgmental approach to providing healthcare. So I asked the question, what about stigma in the health system regarding treatment for people who are HIV positive? And I was blown away by the comment of 2 board members who had the courage, I must say, to stand up and really roast the room about their experiences. And I was astonished at the shock of everyone else in the room who had no idea about it or claimed they didn't. So my question really is, in some of this longitudinal study, is there scope there to do some questioning which compares how things have been and how they're changing? If not, an opportunity then to influence health promotion and really some advocacy for those that really need to make policies that change this approach. And I'm happy to help.
Just to start off, there's definitely scope within longitudinal study design. I wonder, Jean, if you had any comments, given that you've been recently doing some work on stigma and the healthcare settings. Yeah.
In fact, been working quite closely with people who work in health about what they think the strategies are. Yeah, look, I think in longitude, particularly like I was thinking when you're asking that question, of course, the one-off interview that we did in the past, probably we never really got into that kind of detail. And actually, in that pre-treatment phase, people didn't have that much necessarily to do with but I think now there's that possibility because the current focus starts with diagnosis too. So right at the beginning of that process, you can start to identify things that might be going on. And I think you track a lot of stuff around linkage to care. So I think these studies absolutely can, and including perhaps capture what people themselves, and this is not a comment about it, that someone living with HIV should be empowered and challenge stigma. But I think a longitudinal study allows you to see what people themselves might do to kind of deal with it. So I guess broadly my answer is yes, I think there's a real opportunity there. And I certainly, the bits of diagnosis stuff I've read, there are some really great things that happen, and I've still read some pretty things where I go, what? That's still happening. John?
With the caveats that we put in Sue about how memory works, and solidified or changes according to someone else's memory. That's why I was kind of agitated that we talked about the seroconversion studies in 2 years, and then the one in Queensland was 5 years. Could we think more who to bring into those seroconversion studies to get them to do that memory work within the studies?
A final question, Danny.
I'm just going to read my question because I have the habit of stuttering. So I'm speaking from the lens of grief, trauma and displacement, and we know that telling your lived experiences of living with HIV can be a powerful tool to center resources back to a person. It can center agency and power back to your personhood. And I noticed that there was a slide that said participants use the interview experience to reclaim power or status that was lost in their seroconversion or diagnosis experience. So that's even zooming deeper into living with HIV experience. And I imagine it was really a powerful moment for the participants to have that. And it was wonderful that the study somewhat had the scope to explore that. I was just wondering then and now, how do people around those people feel about the reclaiming of the power and the status? And for the actual participants who felt like they were able to reclaim their status and power through retelling that story in the intimate moment during the interview, what have been the impact? And yeah, or do we have a scope in the future to perhaps re-platform what might have happened, the positive impact in their life of reclaiming that power and status, perhaps? Because that'd be...
Just to provide more detail on what I meant by that point, that was one of my slides, was people in the interviews often reflect on an experience that they found quite humiliating if it was diagnosis. They often were really surprised, so they weren't. Yeah, and often they might, maybe it gets back to the last question as well, they don't think they were treated that well in the moment, but they didn't feel able to act in any different way. But they use the interview just to identify that actually wasn't really, that wasn't great. And they'll bring up things to reclaim the identity. And this is what I meant. They'll often talk about their job, their role, like we have a lot of people who work in healthcare in the study. So they'll say, you know, they'll draw on that. They might draw on their educational background, their class, their gender, all sorts of things that kind of reclaim that identity. It's just something that I found quite striking in the way that they were using the interview to yeah, rework that experience. And because some of those experiences were quite lacking or traumatic or just examples of not good care. Don't know if anyone else has got anything else to add to that.
I think because they're a very different style of interview. I guess your comment or question made me think though that there is, certainly in the sense when you're in one of these interviews, and I think Sue, you did these interviews too, this kind of mutual sort of sense making you go through, I guess, and I suppose I'm going to go a bit emotive. You feel the sense of that a person is taking, not necessarily taking control, but that process is, I think generally my sense is a good one, is a sense of I get to talk about this and make sense of it. And some people, you know, well, probably a lot of people, I don't know if you'd say this, so, people talk about that. They talk about, you know, like we're sort of told, oh, should we be interviewing these people? They're so vulnerable. But generally people come to it with a desire to do it. And I think I can say, I think it's largely a good experience. And I guess it is part of that. You get to talk about it with someone who, you know, isn't going all the time, although sometimes you might be going, oh, in your head. But yes, I think there is something about the process of the narrative does give people a certain point.
think that's why I mentioned about clinical research as well. It seems to me that there's a lot of sense making that as a person living with HIV, I get a chance to do in 15 minutes with my doctors, about my health. But the opportunities to do sense making outside of that, we have it with peers and other opportunities. But I think research can provide a genuine space for that to occur. So.
One last one, Phil.
So similar to Garrett, I've been on the other side of this seroconversion study from the lab's perspective. Yeah. And I've always been, and we've made the laboratory diagnosis. And that information, we often wonder as people in the lab how that information is conveyed. And it picks a little bit up on the comments that Gillian made about the stigma and the message at that critical moment. And I wondered whether, given the way and the changing demographic and the changing face of where HIV is being diagnosed, many cases of new diagnoses are being made by GPs who have never made a diagnosis. And at that critical point of conveying that, often devastating message, are there lessons learned over this study through, information gathered during the interviews that could help inform, new GPs who are making that diagnosis to deliver the message in a modern, effective manner that, for the best possible outcome. The way we used to deliver messages, I hear, at St. Vincent's, you speak to doctors who give a cancer diagnosis, for example, and how they deliver that message is often direct. People don't hear anything. You hear that there are techniques. But I think, in the context of HIV, where I do believe stigma still lives, and it's very strong, have we learned anything about that message giving encounter through the study?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from from these studies about the way we could, perform diagnosis better. I guess the piece we wrote on diagnosis assemblages as well, it's like there's a lot of other things that come into, you mentioned the experience of the doctor, and that comes up a lot, suburban GPs who might have had a lot of experience with HIV, but it's actually some time they spent in Africa or something, so the experience of HIV is not related to Australia. But also, even amongst experienced doctors, they bring in some of the epidemiological context as well, and their assumptions about someone who's a gay man who lives in inner city, a city, what they should know and how they should respond versus, say, a woman or someone from a different background. But we also, we didn't talk about it today, but we also do work with service providers, include clinical service providers. And in the pilot work for this study, we also talk to people in surveillance as well about how might make diagnosis. We might change the way in which diagnosis and kind of create better links between all those different aspects. So anyone else want to chime in?
Make a comment about some other work I've been doing, and one of the things is also about slowing down that diagnosis. That actually, obviously, you have to tell the person this thing, but talking to some people who deliver diagnosis, that not everything has to happen, and not everything has to happen in that first appointment, and that actually what might be some of the good practice we could be starting to look at is making it a more, telling people, so today I've told you this, at some point I'm, reasonably soon I'm going to have to ask you about your sexual contacts, but not kind of this And even I know it is important for people to get onto treatment quickly, but they don't necessarily have to process all of that on the same day. But maybe they do perhaps need to do a resistance test, or just kind of, I think there is some stuff we can learn about making it your assemblage idea, actually actively making it a slower assemblage for people.
Thank you. I think we should close. We're way over time. Oh, Garrett, sorry, I can't see you.
It's okay. The one thing that I'd like to add to this is what we've picked up over the past couple of iterations of the studies, the real importance of peer support and making sure that peer support, in whatever form it is, that peer support is available. And too often we've seen in the accounts the fact that referral into some sort of peer support has not been as forthcoming as it probably should be.
Yeah, true. Okay, thank you everybody for coming along today, and thank you to all our speakers. Thanks for your wonderful contributions. Yes, a round of applause. And please join us for drinks and refreshments outside. Hopefully it's arrived. Thanks again, and thanks to everyone who joined online.